And get started. Thank you all so much. Excuse me. Thank you all so much for being here on this Friday morning. This webinar is the second webinar hosted by the DLLC Whole Systems Watershed Approach Committee. What our goal is with these webinars is to really learn about approaches that other organizations have taken to looking at water quality improvements, working with producers, and kind of taking a landscape scale approach. And so we had our first webinar a couple of weeks ago, and we have great speakers today. We have Carly Dean and Allison Gibson. What we hope to do is we're going to take this information and go to a host a farmers forum at Delaware Ag Week. So we have that scheduled. It's a breakfast. If you are interested in attending, please do. Sorry, my animals are just all over this morning. Sorry about that. So we will basically be taking this information and any questions that we generate and have a conversation with some local producers and get their feedback on what may work, what may not work, and the hopes of identifying some tangible outcomes, some tangible next steps that we can take in our regions to tackle water quality improvements on a watershed scale. So super excited. We have, like I said, Carly. She is the director of Chesapeake Tributaries Initiative with the Chesapeake Conservancy. And then we have Allison, who is the executive director of Lancaster. I feel like I'm saying it not the right way, but Lancaster Clean Water Partners. Please, if you could, mute yourselves, turn your cameras off. We will have time for Q&A. And at any time, feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat, and we'll be sure to get to those. And then if you could please introduce yourselves in the chat with your name and your organization, that would be helpful so that we can really understand and see who we have on the call today. So with that, and then as you know, we are recording this webinar so that we can share it out with anybody who isn't able to be here today. So that's just a heads up there. And without further ado, I am going to pass it on to Carly.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar to learn about rapid stream delisting strategies. We're going to focus today on agricultural communities in 7 different counties in Pennsylvania. We'll start by talking through kind of big picture where this program started. We'll give some very specific examples about how it's being applied in Lancaster County. And then we've done some preliminary work in the Wycomico River watershed, the Maryland portion, just to get sort of the folks in the Delmarva thinking about how some of these concepts might be applicable in your communities. So if you're familiar with our organization, we're based in Annapolis, Maryland. We do have an office with 7 staff members in Pennsylvania. Our organization got started with a partnership with the National Park Service, and we have since developed a conservation program, public access, as well as restoration program, and they're all guided by our Conservation Innovation Center, which is our GIS team. So since this work started, we have launched a program based on the work we're going to talk about today. That's kind of our implementation department. So that is our Chesapeake Tributaries Initiative. And so as we go through today, I want you to keep in mind that while we're going to talk about GIS capabilities, we're going to see a lot of maps on the screen. But the Tributaries Initiative is really focused on, once you get this planning done, once you get the GIS work done, how can we support communities to see these plans all the way through? And there are challenges along the way. And it's really important to support folks collectively to make sure that we're addressing those challenges and achieving the water quality and wildlife outcomes, because some of these planning tools, they sit on the shelf, but we want to make sure that they're being implemented. So just keep this in mind as we're going through. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the GIS work that really kind of launched the stream delisting strategy in Pennsylvania. It started with two what we call foundational data sets. So the first one is land use, land cover data. Our Conservation Innovation Center created this through a cooperative agreement with the Chesapeake Bay program. And as you can see in this image, we were previously using the 30 by 30 meter resolution data, and now we've got 1 meter by 1 meter resolution data. Many of you are probably familiar with this and already using it. The thing that was really new about this data is that now we can use it at the project scale, so we can see individual structures and individual trees. And when we think about water quality, the next thing that we needed to do was connect what's happening on the landscape with how pollutants are moving from the landscape into our local creeks and streams. So that's where the high resolution hydrography data came in. And this was really the foundation of the work that we've done in Pennsylvania. When we combine those two data sets, you can see the image on the left is a farm property in central Pennsylvania. The area in gold is areas where the land cover data indicated that there was no riparian forest buffer along this stream. And then the light blue color, using the hydrography data, we were able to map all of the upslope land area that's draining runoff into that stream. So you can start to see how these data sets can be used to identify properties that might be having an outsized impact on that local water quality and wildlife habitat. There was a lot of feedback from our partners in central Pennsylvania to help us understand the scale at which this data might be helpful for decision making, as well as other priorities in the community that we wanted to overlay, whether it be trout habitat or flooding areas or the state designations, whether it's those trout streams or impaired waters. So we're going to come back to that impaired waters data set. So the first thing we did was prioritize all the parcels in the entire region where we were working. So we had 4 counties where we initially started, and these were we've got so many partners working on this together, and it's really important to combine all of those perspectives in this region so that all these different partners have identified places where they want to work together. The challenge with this first iteration of the prioritization is that sort of 2 things. First off, identifying the priority properties. Proactive outreach was kind of new in this region, usually had been more of a first come, first serve basis, where NRCS offices or conservation districts were just responding to farmers that were coming in with challenges in their properties. But now that we're talking about proactive outreach, this scattered approach across all of these counties wasn't working. And there are a number of different logistical reasons that I'm sure you can imagine why it would be hard to travel throughout these entire counties. So therefore, we asked the partners, well, we've spent all this work on this prioritization. What does it look like to become more focused and to narrow down? So we did a survey. And the partners said that they would like to focus on finding impaired stream segments. Those are Clean Water Act, the Integrated Water Quality Report designated as impaired, with only a few of these high priority parcels in the upslope area. So these red, sort of these clusters of red properties, and focus on intensive full farm restoration on those properties. So that led us to the stream delisting strategy. We really liked the idea of focusing on the Clean Water Act and the impaired waters list. The streams are designated as impaired by the Department of Environmental Protection. We are focused on ag impaired streams. There are a number of different impairments, but we did want to focus on impaired streams. We liked this approach because it's really tangible. The stream is either impaired or it's not impaired. And when we're looking at these ag impaired streams, we're focused on aquatic insects. And that's something that's pretty intuitive and easy to communicate. We're not talking about concentrations of, different types of pollutants, things that are a little bit hard to, communicate to a variety of audiences. We're talking about bugs, and then we're talking about fish, And it's really resonating with these communities. The other thing is it's community driven. So it's really about what the local priorities are, and then building on the momentum, places where folks have already had quite a bit of success reaching landowners. So we liked the tangible outcomes of the stream delisting strategy. In order to identify the streams that might be the best candidates for this approach, again, we looked at small stream segments. We're only talking about 1 to 5 miles in length that had upslope catchment areas with high priority parcels. So the efficient implementation, we're going to talk about this in more detail later. Fastest recovery and advancing momentum. This advancing momentum is really, really important. There's only so much you can do from a 30,000-foot view. It's really important to have these partners weigh in on where they think the work could actually get done. Big picture, this strategy is now underway in these 7 counties. So we're talking about central Pennsylvania. You can see State College here in Center County, and then also in Lancaster County. The goal is to delist 30 streams by the year 2030. So delist them from the state's integrated water quality report that they're currently listed as impaired. We've got over 60 partners that we're coordinating with, and it's really important to each partner contributes something unique. So making sure that they're focused on the thing that they're best at and using that regional strategy to leverage different strengths. And then looking at this regionally, it's also gives us the opportunity to apply for regional grants instead of farm by farm. For example, one of the greatest successes in the last couple of years is a $10 million RCPP award. That's the NRCS Regional Conservation Partnership Program, $10 million for Central Pennsylvania, and over $7 million for Lancaster County. I'm going to keep moving here. A couple other big picture successes. We've got support from former Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf on this strategy. It's built into the state's phase 3 watershed implementation plan. And also the Department of Environmental Protection has since retooled one of their funding programs to focus on this stream delisting strategy. So Allison's going to talk a little bit more about Pennsylvania and how this has been incorporated in Lancaster.
Morning all. Thanks, Carly. We are so grateful for Carly and her team's leadership in this strategy and the technical expertise that they bring, plus the procedural expertise, and we'll dive into some of those pieces too. I'm excited to talk about Lancaster, but it's important to give a little bit of context on what are the tools that Pennsylvania and Lancaster partners have to be able to use in this delisting effort. So one of them is our state constitution, and you can read the line here, but that's a right to clean water is a huge tool that we have in Pennsylvania to be able to help motivate, but also lean on when we need that for keeping momentum going. So next slide shows us a timeline that has some specifics about Lancaster. And again, just from a context standpoint,
could you everybody please remember to mute yourselves if you are not Allison or Carly. We do hear some background noise. Thank you.
Thanks. Just wanted to give this as context. The timeline shows a kind of condensed since 1700. We acknowledge the Native American communities and the thousands of years that they were here and on the land, and communities here. And looking at it since 1700, when really massive changes started to happen. And so farming came in, the Industrial Revolution came in, and then pieces that we're more used to hearing about, like the Clean Water Act, the county conservation districts were formed. And then this really small red section is where we're looking at this type of restoration and the concentration and efforts. So it's this really small amount of time that we're trying to make a big change for hundreds and thousands of years worth of impacts on the land. And when we talk about impaired waters, what we're doing on the land and the impacts that that has on our waterways. It's just helpful to remember the timeline that we're also working within here. A shout out to Stroud for this slide is from them. So more about Lancaster. Okay, what are we talking about here? What's going on in Lancaster that's creating this kind of space? And Carly, you're driving on slides. So if you can just kind of keep clicking, these are all the local governments, all the municipalities here in Lancaster. There's over 60 in the county, and about 2/3 of them have their own MS4 permit. So Carly, you can just keep clicking. There's a couple different links here. Those are those MS4 boundaries. We have many, different school districts as well. There we go. So there's about 13 or 14 different school districts. Those lines don't always match with the local government lines. Carly, I don't know if it matters, but we lost the full screen image.
Oh, let me try to get that back.
No problem. Lancaster actually has a really large refugee population, and it's a wonderful piece of our community. The economic value add and contribution that they make is a huge part of Lancaster's culture and economy as well. So just, I'll keep moving verbally as we get back to slides. No worries there, Carly. Thanks so much. There's some great elements of culture here in Lancaster, and we hear about so many of these different ones related to water quality. Things like best places to retire.
I'm going to try to go back, Allison, to
That's okay. On the next one,
the-
when we get to the next slide, it'll be easier. We'll get rid of that link. My fault on that.
That's okay.
Lancaster is one of the best places to retire in the US. So when we think about top of lists for things, Lancaster has all kinds of reasons to be at the top of lists. But when we think about land use and best place to retire, lots of people are coming here to live, which is wonderful, but that means we have to be looking ahead and planning for that land use changes. Also, the impact of healthcare and the need for a higher presence of healthcare, depending on the aging population and the changes of that. Some of the other things that Lancaster is known for is that EPA, it's got its eye on us. There are visits happening for different reasons, whether they're inspections and also collaborations. So that's one other element. The other parts of Lancaster is that, as Carly mentioned, this stream delisting strategy is looking at agriculturally impaired streams, and impaired means it's not safe to go swimming. People don't feel comfortable accessing the water, and there's not a lot of places to do that from a recreational standpoint. But it also means that the bugs can't even live here. So if even the bugs don't feel healthy, we're in a bad spot. So the real problem is that over half of our streams are impaired. In the Bay watershed, we've got the highest loading rates, but we also have the solution of building a local multi-sector collaboration. The Clean Water Partners play that backbone organization role. And then the tools that we have to make that happen are things like our common agenda. People ask, well, what's your strategic plan? Well, the common agenda is that, and it is based on a shared vision of clean and clear water in Lancaster County by 2040. And our mission as that backbone is to make sure that everybody doing this clean water work has the capacity and the resources they need to do more of it at a bigger pace and a faster scale. We've got big goals to meet. So how we're going to do that? And our values help ground us. We want to make sure that we're collaborating and not duplicating, never intending and making sure that keeping ourselves accountable to not duplicate something that a partner organization is doing and is really good at. So making sure that those are part of our conversation at all times. Always operating with a bias towards action. We want to be able to put these ideas, put these strategies into action right away. So that's where the momentum comes from. And you have to be able to trust each other to do that. Our community members, like we just ran through with all those different cultural elements and pieces that make up Lancaster, we have to be able to trust each other. That doesn't happen overnight, and it's not automatic. So that takes effort, and that takes conversation, and that takes community building. And within the community, clean and clear water for all members of our community is part of our values as well. Making sure that we are amplifying those diverse voices as our community reflects. We want our work to reflect our community as well. And all of this, we have to be transparent. We want to put things out to as many different places as we can, doing that with openness and authenticity. So some of the ways that we are doing that and some of the opportunities that we have in Lancaster is through our CAP process. So the state of Pennsylvania has that watershed implementation plan. The countywide action plan is an opportunity where Lancaster, York, Franklin, and Adams County were the first tier to be invited to write that countywide action plan. We wrote that in 2018 and have since been implementing it. In Lancaster County, that cap the breakdown for us, you can see the top line, the top bar, that is Lancaster's nitrogen goal. It's about 11 million pounds, and that's about 20% of the state's goal. So if we keep going through some of our graphics here, it'll show you that when we look at that number, agriculture is actually our biggest opportunity to achieve the nitrogen goals, but our average farm size in Lancaster is 75, the average farm in PA is 150. So keep that in mind when we start talking about having to zoom in and having to pick certain areas that are going to be our best opportunity to see that restoration. So here's some of the nitrogen numbers. Agriculture, like I said, the biggest opportunity, but we can't tackle all of them at once. There's over 5,000 farms in Lancaster County alone. And when they're all that small, it's a big outreach effort. So how do we prioritize? Knowing it is completely possible, but we have to make sure that there is the right capacity, the dollars, the people, the skills, the expertise, the momentum, the processes, all those pieces are how we're going to achieve that. So just a couple snapshots of what we've been doing, what we've been up to, and how we're creating that progress so far. This is a list of different titles of practices and or BMPs at certain project sites. There's lots of success stories on the website. And Carly, again, if you don't mind just continuously clicking, I've got a bunch of pictures here from the field of a mix match of CREP projects and urban BMPs. Culleton Park is one that has a lot of rain gardens that were put in, along with public art, making sure that multilingual pieces are part of that, as well as public art, using our buffer action team to identify some project sites. And then let's just start brainstorming. What could it look like instead of a dirt pathway? How can we ensure that erosion and nitrogen needs are being addressed that meet the farmer's goals in this case? Or in the Culleton Park example, what are some of the changes? And then we start applying the actual BMP, whether it's from the cast model or the thing that makes most sense on the ground. So those are a couple samples. This is also the kind of practice that we have in our CAP and are going to help us meet those big goals. So this is also to showcase the different types of partners that we have working on this effort. Floodplain restoration is part of that. You got to match it up with trails, with MS4 projects, with planning, like we said, about looking far enough into the future about the kinds of practices that are important for us as land use changes are happening. Cover crops and no-till or low residue till, those are all very common in Lancaster. We're really green right now, which is really exciting. And you don't think of it for this time of year during the harvest, but cover crops are already in and a huge presence here across the county. Green roofs, urban BMPs, Lancaster City is one of the leads, and just always want to give a shout out to, again, the diversity of the types of BMPs that we have in Lancaster. We know there's lots more to do, but it's important to showcase what has been done and how much effort there has been for years and years by all these different partner organizations. So I'm saying all of this because we brought all of these partners together when we were asked, well, what's the ideal? What do you actually need to see that change? Okay, you've done these things, but in order to meet these big goals, what do you have to do differently? So no expectation that you're reading that table, but as we pull together just a few snapshots of what has been part of our last year, these voices and perspectives include the funders and the agency level leaders. That ideal process table is all kinds of ideas of where the funding's coming from and how we can match them together to meet these goals. Jamboards and post-it notes and virtual meetings through COVID, and making sure that we have lots of different perspectives and people at the table. Sometimes that's even easier with just printed out big maps. And we'll get into that a little bit more at the landowner level. But as partner organizations, coming to a table might be virtual. It could be a real table where we're looking at maps. It could be out in the field where we're making sure we understand what it means to delist a stream, like literally the difference in size between a pebble and a boulder and the kind of water flow. It's important to bring in the experts. So this one is where we had DEP staff who are the ones that would actually determine if a healthy stream healthy enough, long enough to to take off of the impaired list, we brought them out to teach all of us to work with volunteers who can be doing some of these assessments. So again, the voices and perspectives that have to be part of this. And I like to include this one only because the gentleman who's in the front in the waiters, so that's Dustin, and he works for DEP. He's one of the guys that can tell us if it's impaired or not. And then behind him is the farmer in his straw hat, shaking hands with the coordinator for MS4 for the state. So it's important to, again, note the places of common interest and the places that we can all be equal partners in this work. And just being in the stream sometimes is the best place to do that. So again, a thank you to Carly and her team for organizing those kind of events, providing these kind of maps and giving us these tools to be able to get to this zoomed in level of how are we actually going to achieve these goals, building on the momentum. And I'm going to let her start to zoom us in on what we've been doing here in Lancaster.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Allison. That was a great perspective from Lancaster County. The next thing that we're going to do is dig into a specific example of a stream that's a focus of the delisting strategy. Before we do that, I wanted to pause and see if anybody had any burning questions that about what's been presented so far. We do have 25 minutes at the end for a bigger discussion, but anything that you need clarity on so far?
We have one question in the chat from Evan. It reads, when picking streams to target for delisting, how do you determine how much of the stream? Is it based on the extent included in the 303D report? Or do you pick smaller segments of impaired rivers or streams?
So we're going to talk about that specific in Pennsylvania in a minute. It's different than the way Maryland does it, but I'll give you some specific examples in the next couple of slides. Thank you for that question.
I don't see any other questions coming through right now.
Okay. Then we'll move on to that example. Just going to make that note. 303D. Okay, so how did we select streams? What does this look like in a particular stream in Lancaster County? So the first criteria that we wanted to consider is the fastest recovery. So remember that when we did the survey of partners, they really wanted to focus on impaired streams. But we're not talking about streams that are really severely impaired for this strategy, because the goal is 30 by 30, as I mentioned. And the idea is that if we can get the implementation done, get the BMPs in place between 1 and 5 years, give the stream about 5 years potentially to recover, then these streams could be delisted possibly within 10 to 12 years from the first point. So we're not talking about severely degraded streams. We're talking about streams that are nearing that threshold that Pennsylvania uses to determine whether the stream is impaired or not. And again, that's based on the aquatic insect communities or the macropenthic invertebrates, benthic macroinvertebrates. So that IBI score, Index of Biotic Integrity, is that score of those aquatic insects. And this map is showing in red the places that are pretty severely impaired. In blue, places are that the monitoring data shows us that they're not as severely impaired. And this is because the stream delisting strategy is about picking goals that are tangible and that are feasible in the near term, because as Allison mentioned, Lancaster's had so much pressure from across the Bay watershed. We really want to give our partners and landowners things to celebrate, shorter term milestones as we address, an entire Bay watershed's challenges and improvements. So fastest recovery are places that are close to that delisting.
Carly, one piece related to that DEP pointed out to us along the way is that definition of being delisted is one goal, but sometimes you can change the source of impairment or change the cause of it. They were emphasizing that those are wins. So things along the way are important to celebrate and acknowledge that that's progress. getting something completely removed from the impaired waters list is a huge endeavor. And like Carly said, can take 5 to 10 to 20 years, depending on the system. And so just getting the change in impairment or the cause, that's something to celebrate and aim for too.
Exactly. Thank you, Allison. So let's talk about a very specific example. This is a stream that is a tributary to the Little Conestoga River. And this is, we're calling it the Hammertown Road. So higher IBI scores is what we were just talking about with the fastest recovery. The IBI score was 39 for this example. I know Maryland does it a little bit differently, but relatively high across the county. So this blue star down here is the downstream monitoring location that we're considering for this stream segment. And you can see already that this is pretty small, right? You can see individual properties. We're not talking about huge watersheds here. We also use that hydrography data to map out the upslope land area that's contributing runoff to this particular stream segment. So again, we're not talking about a huge area, 895 acres, 2.1 miles of impairment. Bite-sized chunks, right? We went from the entire Bay watershed to the entirety of Pennsylvania to Lancaster County. Now we're talking about something that's much smaller and feasible. On with that, looking at the land cover data, if the entire catchment is in agriculture, that's going to be pretty hard to work through in the next 5 to 10 years. We want places that have some forested cover where those insect populations maybe are already existing. The next thing is efficient implementation. Again, going back, like, are there the fewest number of parcels that we have to work on that are contributing, the greatest opportunity to improve the water quality. Fewer number of parcels, the easier it is to get work done efficiently. Advancing momentum. Where do we already have relationships that we can build on? Maybe some work has already been done, but there are more BMPs that are needed. Maybe there's a Lancaster Farmland Trust has an easement on one of these properties, so we already have a good relationship. Again, advancing that momentum is really key here. We're talking it's not really working, and we're not really intending to work in places where we have to convince landowners who are pretty hesitant. We want to work with places where the landowners are interested already. And these are some of our partners that we're working in this catchment: Stroud, Team Ag, Lancaster Farmland Trust, the Conservation District, Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Okay. This also took a lot of time to build trust, as Allison mentioned, getting folks together, sharing their experiences. We've got data sharing agreements. There's an expectation of confidentiality, but this is really important to coordinate partners. So efficient implementation. Again, we want these projects to be done quickly, and we want to see the improvements quickly. So if we have projects that are really going to be a major construction, we're thinking urban stream restoration, these are important to do. They certainly are another strategy that's happening in the county, but these are definitely longer term. It's going to be much longer term to see those environmental improvements. This would be a major, floodplain reconnection project. Worth doing, important to do, not necessarily part of this particular strategy. So again, you saw this earlier: fastest recovery, efficient implementation, advancing momentum. When you find a stream that looks good in all of those places, that's a good fit for the stream delisting strategy. So initially we looked at 20 catchments, streams, and then what we're calling the catchment is that watershed that's draining runoff into that stream. This was the subject of a $10 million proposal to the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP. There was some funding secured from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. and then the DEP's Watershed Renaissance Initiative that I mentioned earlier. So focusing first on the ones that are most promising, because that's as much as you can get through in one meeting. So let's consider logistics too. Again, we talked about the catchment area being this area. You can see this map is flipped. Catchment area being the unit that we're focused on. And then also printing these big maps out. Allison and I both had some slides earlier about that. My sort of rule of thumb is that if you print a big map out and put it on the table and you can't see individual properties, you can't really see that barnyard area, then you probably need to focus on a smaller geography, because we need to get through these catchments in a single meeting. We don't want to take hours and hours every time to talk about 50 different parcels. We really want to hone in. We really want to focus in on work that can be done in a relatively short amount of time. And on here too is landowner events, right? If we have a sort of peer-to-peer event where folks are learning about a restoration project that was completed, where does their property relate to that particular project? Are they upstream? Are they downstream? They start to see this as their own catchment community, which is a new term that we're starting to use now. So this one, go ahead, Allison.
This one's a cool example because this is one of those delineated catchments. And within this, if you keep clicking, there's a picture of a gentleman named Roger Rohr, and he's had a buffer for 20 plus years. He's known as the guy who has this buffer. He's a really wonderful farmer, really wonderful storyteller. And he also likes to hunt, and on his farm within the buffer, especially. So he's got years and years of this, and knowing that over time you build relationships with your neighbors. Those maps are important because then you can see where you fit in. And if somebody's living close to Roger, understanding what his goals are, and then understanding what their neighbors are. And then when you can see that on a map, bringing these types of technology, types of storytelling together, that makes the difference, because a lot of the power is in the messenger. So if it's your neighbor next door that talks about it, or it's the seed dealer, or it's the co-op person that a farmer trusts and talks to regularly, then that's the person that we need at the table as one of the partner organizations doing this stream delisting work and building that catchment community, like Carly mentioned. So with this piece, and this example in particular, the punchline here is that Roger's stream was delisted. It came off the impaired list. It took a long time and took an amazing amount of work, but it happens. It's completely possible. Like we said, and I can keep going, Carly, that this bubble picture is to acknowledge that everybody's goals are still important. Everybody's missions and visions and everybody's local goals are still happening. This catchment work aligns them more tightly. It brings everybody around one common goal. And in Lancaster's case, it's clean and clear by 2040. Again, it doesn't mean anybody's duplicating, nobody's goes away. It's just that they're more tightly aligned. And these specific goals and local efforts give us that tool to make that possible. We have to be able to show that, though. We have to be able to show the progress, keep everybody engaged along the way. And the dashboard that the Chesapeake Conservancy has created for us helps make that possible. Carly, I'm not sure if you want to do the dashboard or the actual database first.
Yeah, we can talk about the dashboard first.
Okay.
So if anybody's familiar with the collective impact model, I think Envision the Chop Tank uses this. One of the key elements is setting numeric goals, setting metrics that we're all working toward together. So for each of these catchments, we have an upslope area BMP goal that we're trying to achieve, shown here in the red line. The green shows the work that's already been done. The yellow area is represents the acres of land owned by landowners who are interested in doing restoration work. So this is like sort of this gold area is our opportunity to get that work done. Riparian area goal, we have a percentage of the riparian area that we want to see forested. In this catchment, we've achieved that. The delisting dashboard is really helpful. We look at it in every meeting to see how close we are to achieving those goals and keep moving forward. Catchment meetings, we've got a lot of people. We've got everybody is contributing to these meetings, talking about some successes that they've had in that particular catchment. We try to do these quarterly where we give updates, and in between the meetings, partners will meet individually to talk about like a particular restoration project. But it's really helpful to collect all the data about the progress that's been made since our last catchment meeting. I'll give just a quick screenshot of what this looks like. So we go through all of the properties in a particular catchment. We take notes about the progress that's been made. The priority watershed or the priority parcels are here in gold. So those are the fewest number of parcels that are going to get us to those numeric targets that I showed in the dashboard. We've got information, GIS information about the property. We talk about the percentage of progress that's been made and whether or not they're amenable. We also look at things like whether there are livestock on the property, and that also, combined with some of that geospatial data, helps us come up with a cost estimate on what we think we need to raise. And that's really helpful when you think about regional grant proposals. We can start to see, you know, if these many landowners are amenable to restoration, how much money do we think we could raise in the next 1 to 2 years to get those projects started. And then also we talked a little bit about we already showed the progress bars, partner action items. This is something that we've added recently. We've got over 30 catchments in Lancaster County and different partners listed as the point person. So instead of having them go through this entire spreadsheet, we've got this feature now where I've hidden the landowner names, but imagine that each one of these is a landowner and has an address. Any organization can just click and see what they've been assigned after the last meeting. And this is what we want to report on every time. So that's our spreadsheet.
Harley, one other thing to mention with that specific part of the process, you did call it out earlier. We do have a data sharing agreement that we all sign because this is really private information in many cases. There's a lot of relationship building that is documented here that we need to respect among each other. And that's a process that's part of the trust building, and it takes time. It acknowledges that in some cases, these partner organizations may typically, or maybe traditionally, had been in a competitive situation. Maybe they would talk to each other at conferences or something, but we're asking people to operate differently, and behavior change is tough. It takes time, and it's not always smooth. So just remembering that tools like data sharing agreements give you something to lean on, at least a baseline of where everybody understands how it works.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Allison.
This
collaboration continuum, perfect.
Yeah. Yep, this kind of shows what we're working within and acknowledging that competition is part of collaboration. It maybe more traditionally was a bigger part, and we're asking people to move along this continuum more towards coordination, collaboration, and you're building the trust as you do that, but you're also losing or tightening your turf. That could be physical turf, like maybe it's a farm that somebody else works with, and we have always prioritized respect for existing relationships. So if there is a technical service provider that works with a specific farmer already, then keep that. Keep the funding, keep the relationship, keep the technical expertise there. It is never an intention of this collaborative approach to change any of that. It is a respect for existing relationships.
Okay, so this is just a big picture, what we talked about today, you know, selecting the catchments based on all of those different criteria we talked about, talking about which parcels are shovel ready, landowner amenable funding and technical assistance needs, outreach plans. The other thing that we talked briefly about is a monitoring plan, and I believe somebody asked that here. So in some cases, the monitoring data from DEP is 10 or 20 years old. We didn't have a rigid formula when we were selecting the catchments initially. You know, if the monitoring data was old, but we know a lot of work has been done there, that's okay to just kind of say, you know, this is likely pretty close to achieving that threshold for delisting. But we also have a number of monitoring partners that we're now working with to make sure we have up-to-date data for all of these streams. So Penn State Ag Environment Center, we've worked with some conservation districts. Susquehanna University is a big partner on this. So that's another piece that is really important here. And Department of Environmental Protection has offered to help us do some monitoring, but we know that they've got a small department and they can't do it all on their own. So monitoring data and working with a number of different partners to keep that up to date. Implementation, we just talked about how that work gets done. We're really focused on full farm restoration. One thing that's not on here, which is kind of the next phase, as we've gotten quite a bit of implementation done since this work really started in 2019, 2020. Long-term maintenance of these projects, ensuring that the BMPs are functioning, as well as conservation and preservation. You know, we don't want to get these streams off the list only to have them come back on in a few years. So those are some things that aren't on here quite yet. Some successes. So the draft 2024 Pennsylvania Integrated Water Quality Report is showing delistings in 4 of the catchments in central Pennsylvania. I have to say that there's a public comment period open now. The report then needs to be submitted to EPA for approval. So these aren't official delistings. We'll get that, you know, final report hopefully in kind of late winter, early spring. But something is working here. Now there's each stream has a little bit of a different story. You know, in some cases, maybe it shouldn't have been on the list in the first place, but it was incorporated because there was maybe some incomplete data. So that tributary to Half Moon Creek might be one example of that. But if we look over here at Turtle Creek, number 3, there are 2 segments that have been delisted, or I'm sorry, preliminary delisting. I have to caveat that preliminary delistings. The first restoration project that went in the ground on one of these segments happened in 2013. So 10 years preliminary delisting. This is possible. Okay, I'm going to pause for a minute, and then I've got some examples of how this might be scaled to Delmarva. I see a couple of questions. I can start with the questions in the chat, and then we can open it up to anybody who wants to add anything.
That works.
So the first question here is from Evan Isaacson. When picking streams to target, how do you determine how much of the stream is it based on the extent included in the 303D report? So in Pennsylvania, the smallest segment that can be delisted has a unit called a COM ID, and that segment could be as small as a quarter of a mile, maybe even less. So those COM IDs can be delisted. Now, in most of these areas, we have between 5 and maybe 15 COM IDs. So what you're seeing here is not an entire stream, the entire length of it in these catchment areas with the preliminary delistings. We're focusing on some of those individual COM IDs, small segments that we can take off the list as a success. We talked about how often the sites are evaluated with IBI scores in Pennsylvania. The important thing to keep in mind too is that not anybody can submit policy level data to DEP to incorporate into the integrated report. The biologists have to follow a specific protocol that I believe is also part of the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative. They need to be audited by Department of Environmental Protection, and then that data can be submitted. So DEP has a schedule, but some of our partners who have been audited by DEP can submit at any time. And our goal was to get up-to-date IBI for all of these catchments within the next few years. Are there specific BMPs being targeted that you believe will have the greatest benefit for IBIs? We always try to implement riparian forest buffers. The impact on temperature, habitat is really essential. But in general, our goal is to do full farm restoration on every single one of these properties. That means implementing everything that's in their comprehensive nutrient management plan, so the CNMP, which is also, part of those NRCS programs that really are aimed at addressing those. So we think about maybe 3 different categories. There's the riparian area restoration, which is those buffers. Livestock exclusion fencing could be part of that. In-stream restoration, which would include some habitat work. We work a lot with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Trout Unlimited to put some habitat structures. And then the barnyard or the upslope work. A lot of these are dairy farms. They also might have some crop on the property. So we're talking about really modernizing the barnyards. Any other questions before we get into the Wicomico example? Okay, we'll keep moving. So what does this look like in the Delmarva? The way that the integrated report is written and the monitoring data is a little bit different in each of the states. Of course it is. The agencies are all implementing the Clean Water Act, but they have flexibility a little bit about how they implement the Clean Water Act and determine impairments. So this is really important as we're thinking about Maryland and Virginia. I have not done the research yet on Delaware, but I'm learning the different terminology that's used, the example of the use and the parameters and the unit of assessment. So in Pennsylvania, I mentioned that COM ID as the unit of assessment. In Maryland, I'm learning a little bit more about the Maryland 8-digit watersheds that are pretty, large in size, but going forward, Department of the Environment has their own sort of delisting plan about how to hone in on smaller segments that maybe that monitoring data could sort of correct those smaller segments that were listed as impaired in the first place. That's a whole discussion, but learning about that unit of assessment and the different parameters. So one thing to look at if you are considering delisting, make sure that we understand the parameters that are used and tailoring those best management practices and the appropriate scale to make sure we're meeting those thresholds for that delisting. This is what I'm learning about quite a bit right now. We did some preliminary mapping of the Wicomico River watershed. Again, we just looked at Maryland for this exercise. We do have these layers on a web map that we put together, so I can send the link around to everyone. The watershed in Maryland is just over 120,000 acres, 27,700 acres of farmland, or 22% of the watershed is in agriculture. I know that there's an existing data layer of poultry houses. We did do sort of a quick identification or quick mapping of poultry operations. I'm not entirely sure how that compares with the one that exists, but 87 likely poultry operations that are shown here in this gold color. Stream center lines, I didn't mention that. These are impaired streams based on the 303 D list. And then we also looked at the number of parcels in the watershed, and just for the visualization, I just filtered out to parcels that are over 150 acres. So you can start to see, maybe we could break these down into smaller tributaries. Maybe we could look at places that have, maybe only a few poultry operations that could be addressed, or maybe just a few larger parcels that make our lives easier when we only have to work with a couple of landowners. So this is kind of a preliminary analysis just to get you thinking about what this could look like. I will also mention that our Conservation Innovation Center is currently working on a ditch mapping project. We talked a lot about central Pennsylvania and Lancaster. The physical landscape looks quite a bit different. Central Pennsylvania, there's a lot of topography. We're talking about valleys in between, a mountainous area. The analysis is not going to translate one-to-one to the Delmarva. So obviously the ditches are a big, part of the landscape here. So this preliminary mapping, or this mapping project that's underway, might be really helpful in this area. And I think that's it. So I think we've got some time for questions now. I'd love to get your thoughts on, kind of what came up as you were looking at this map. But I appreciate everyone's time together and look forward to our discussion now.
Thank you both so much. That was really, really great information. A lot of it resonated with me, and I'm sure resonated with a lot of people on this call. So yes, now is the time for our Q&A and discussion portion of our meeting. And so if everybody could turn your cameras back on, we will use the hand raise function on Zoom first. We'll actually, if you have any questions in the chat that we haven't gotten to, we'll get to those first. And then after questions in the chat, we'll use the hand raise function on Zoom. So if you would like to ask a question or have a comment, please raise your hand and we'll call on you to keep it a little bit organized. And then, some things to think about too, in terms of the DLLC work, how might these ideas work in our region? And yeah, so go ahead if you have any questions, either use the chat or go ahead and raise your hand virtually. And there was, I thought I saw a question from you, Paula, in the chat, but now I don't see it anymore.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that again, just to kick things off. You guys talked about catchments, and I think they're just portions of the watershed. I was just wondering if there was any sort of hydrographic definition of that, or how you determine a catchment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So once we identified the stream segment that we wanted to focus on for our discussion, we decided, like the partners said, okay, I want to go downstream to this point. And from that point, we used some high resolution hydrography data that looked at topography of the area and sort of mapped out all of that drainage area to that point. This is really similar to the NHD, the National Hydrography Data Set catchments, but because we really wanted to customize that downstream point, we created our own catchment area for that individual stream segment.
Thank you.
And that's to be a starting point. It doesn't have to be a hard and fast line around those edges. We'll get into conversations with people doing outreach, and they're like, well, the guy lives right there. But, if it's outside the catchment, how can you say they don't have access to the same kind of funding? And so they give us a place to start. But when you function like a community, neighbors start to see the progress and they're like, oh, I want to try that BMP too. So it is just a place to start. When we look at our metrics, it gives us also a specific area to say, we started here and now we're this much further along.
Any other questions from the group?
I have a question for the group that maybe somebody might be able to answer. Is when we talk about like the delisting being the priority in this region, is it as big of a driver in the Delmarva as it would be, as it is in Pennsylvania? Do we talk a lot about the impaired waters list in your partnership meetings?
I think that's a great question. I'm looking at a couple of our members who have joined. Let's see, or Michelle, you might want to address that.
It would be nice if Alan or David jumped in. Alan.
Hi, everybody. This is David Baird with the Sussex Conservation District in Delaware. And we pretty much work under the assumption that all of our waters are impaired, because the majority of those are that's the case on the majority of the waterways in Delaware. So it's not really a focus of conversations. It's just an assumption that we assume as a given and move forward from there.
Do you
Yeah.
look,
Oh, I was just gonna say in Delaware too, there's different people taking data at different points. And so there's a couple of questions going around of, well, whose data is better and can we incorporate more data? And so that's, kind of another reason why we don't always think specifically about stream delisting, at least from the center's standpoint.
and when you say data, you're talking about in-stream monitoring data?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Alan. I vice chair the DLLC that helped sponsor this event. Thank you guys for great presentation. Really a lot of super information, and Paul, Michelle, David, others that are part of DLC can correct me if I'm wrong, but the DLC, is about convening diverse partners at the intersection of the poultry industry and the environment and trying to find solutions. Our group of diverse partners on the steering committee has I think found common ground in this idea of a whole watershed systemic approach. Certainly the idea of impaired waterways as an anchor of that approach, or potentially a driver, has some interest among some of the members. So that's really sort of the background of how we got to this point and bringing you all in and trying to learn about models and opportunities and ways we can take what's out there and take the next step. So yes, impaired waterways are of interest to this group. Thank
you, Alan. What scale do you tend to sort of collaborate around? Is it the for example, Wicomico, would that be one of the focus areas, or do you get in smaller than that?
Well, we are DLLC, so it is the Delmarva Peninsula. So at the macro level, it's Maryland, Delaware, Virginia's portion of those states on the peninsula that is sort of our overall geographic area. We are listening and learning right now for scales, geographies that makes sense to engage in. I don't know that we've settled on 8-digit, 10-digit, 12-digit, some of the smaller sections of the Wicomico you were showing in one of your later slides. It seems from your presentation, get down to, I love your story about put the map on the table. If you can't actually see pieces of the farm, then you're not at a small enough resolution to have a productive conversation. That resonates with me. It seems to make a lot of sense to be able to be clear about the geography that we need to focus on and what the opportunity is, based on that sort of specificity. So if anybody else has anything to add there, but
I'll add on to what Alan's saying is that in Delaware, from the larger level, it's all Chesapeake Bay, Delaware Bay, or inland bays related. But at the more local level, we tend to dive into our public ditch world, which we refer to as our tax ditch system, which has its own established watersheds. That's more like, I'm going to refer to it as the catchment areas that you had referenced in your presentation, that offers a lot of opportunities to break things down into smaller watersheds that are much more manageable. The nice part about that approach is that there's already a governing structure around those public ditches. So that's been well established for decades now.
Paula, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just going to offer to Alan's point and I guess to Carly's question, the Delmarva Land and Litter Collaborative has largely been focused on big topics like Alan was talking about at the Delmarva scale to date. Things like the phosphorus management tool in Maryland and litter transport and ammonia dynamics. So we've been sort of focused on that. And this approach that we're starting with these webinars is really to help us understand how do we target smaller areas? What would that look like?
Paula, one piece that I would add to that is that in Lancaster, while we say that the strategy is called the stream delisting, and yes, it is a goal to get things off of the official impaired list, but that might not be the headline of why a meeting happens or why a community cares about that what the community cares about. It might be that their drinking water is, the nitrates are too high in their wells. It might be that they can't fish there and their grandparents used to. It might be that the land development has changed so much that now there are different occurrences they're seeing on a regular basis that they didn't before. And so that might be the local reason and the thing that brings people together, but the reason that the partner organizations are working together and why a certain spot has been selected is ultimately to get it to healthy enough status to be taken off of that impaired list.
Agreed.
So like Roger, if he couldn't hunt anymore, oh my gosh, it would be a totally different story.
There's a question in the chat. It seems like your program has focused mainly on ag runoff. Have you incorporated any suburban streams into your program?
Carly, I'll take the first stab at that because we have used the same approach. And Carly mentioned the RCPP because yes, that is focused on ag, but we also have it with a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant that does focus on the areas where ag and urban or suburban land use intersect. In Lancaster County, with the urban area on the MS4 map, really it intersects with agriculture land use all the time or pretty often across the county. So that's a funding specific, but we have a map that shows where those overlap too. So some of these catchments do have a focus that includes suburban streams or suburban type land use, but it's a lot harder to tackle outreach when you're looking at so many more landowners in a suburban area. If you're talking with HOAs, that's one thing, but if you're talking to 200 different landowners in a suburban space about delisting or what's their local hook, like that, back to that same question, it's a different conversation. And the causes for impairment are going to be different as well.
Yeah, those areas, like Allison mentioned, it might be one catchment and the headwaters, it's all farms.
Yeah.
And then it goes right into suburban and right into urban. So you might have 4 or 5 different sources and causes between all of those different land use types. So if we can remove just the ag cause, there is a whole list that is the ag impaired streams. It comes off that list. That's a success. Might not come off of the other lists right away, but that's why understanding how those integrated reports are written is really important to this particular strategy. And
Carly, we didn't talk about it, but we have a catchment lead for each of these areas. So there's a local person or a local partner organization that is known as either self-nominated or selected by the group to be the catchment lead. And they help run the meeting. They are paid for their time. They bring in some extra local knowledge. They might be that neighbor that can more comfortably talk to people there, or they may have been the one that's been implementing riparian buffers for 15 years in that space. And they serve as the catchment lead to rally the partner organizations, if not the landowners in addition to that.
That's a really interesting model, and especially like paying them for their time to recognize their contributions. So are they contracted by Lancaster Clean Water Partners?
They are. We, like Carly said, when we're looking for BMP funding, we're also looking for people funding. And so being able to pay them for their time to manage things, like that type of capacity is what we need in order to keep building the momentum, to acknowledge their expertise and their time, but also be able to do it in a unique way. If it's a suburban area, the need and the driver might be really different. And sometimes that means it's a municipal staff. In other places, it's a nonprofit that has been doing CREP for years and years and years. And so it just depends where you are. And so we really appreciate the flexible and creative support that many of the funders have given us for that. It's also been part of the shift that we've been pushing and seeing from the funders, from the agency, like Carly mentioned, the Watershed Renaissance Initiative from the state. It's funding for planning and sort of this pre-build work. So we've seen that shift and it's making a difference.
Allison, since you mentioned flexible funding, I do want to talk a little bit about how important it is to have across a region, a pot of funding that's our TBD funding that often will come from a foundation where when you submit a grant application, you might have a few individual projects identified with the BMPs listed and a specific budget. Setting some of that funding aside to be able to respond to a landowner who shows interest right away, rather than saying, okay, I'm really glad that you're excited about this project. We're going to submit an application to NIFWIF or to EQIP next year. And then we'll hear about it in 6 months, and then we might be able to spend it later. Like that, I feel has been a really important element to this. And I don't know that we would have seen so much acceleration if we didn't have that pot of TBD funding.
Yeah, that's, I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's something that we have talked about within the DLLC, and then, you know, through my work, is making sure that we don't have that big lag. So we're not losing interest, because that can happen, or, you know, plans change or whatever. And so you said most of your like TBD is from foundations.
Yeah, so we have some private family foundations that have allowed us to have that flexibility with funding. That's also really important. I'll add, some of the state or federal funding programs might have restrictions on what can be implemented, and then filling that in if the farmer wants something a little bit different with that private foundation funding. National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, we have both the Clean Water Partners and the Conservancy in Central Pennsylvania have funding from NIFWIF through their INSR program, which just opened up, I think maybe yesterday or the day before. Applications are due in February. We were able to set aside in that application, you know, this funding, we don't have a particular project lined up, but as soon as we get one, we're ready to spend it. Let's see, Department of Environmental Protection, through their Growing Greener program, we also have some TBD funding. That's different than how they used to think about those grants. One thing that they told us was really appealing to the way we approached it is that that funding is available regionally and gets distributed to a lot of different partners. So I don't know if we were our own organization that was applying to hold on to our own pot of TBD funding, if that would have been as interesting or as appealing to to Department of Environmental Protection. But since that, you know, since that goes out to a number of different partners, that I think that's why it's been working that way.
Harley mentioned about printing out maps, but you guys know, with your farmer outreach and the work that you do, you got to provide breakfast, you got to provide donuts, you got to have reasons for people to come to any public event, and that's for any type of landowner. But the that TBD funding can help with those kind of costs too.
Great point. Which is a good opportunity to remind everybody that we are hosting a farmer breakfast at the Delaware during Delaware Ag Week. So if you're interested in attending that, we do have the registration information, and we still have a few more minutes. I think questions are slowing down a bit, but I want to give another minute or so to see if anybody else has any other questions.
Could I ask another one?
Yes.
We've talked about, I know that there's a story map that maybe some of the data that we've shared already, you know, that preliminary analysis, you know, could be kind of popped in there that might be helpful. I'm curious if there's a, you know, there's a big gap or a big need for any other type of data analysis that my team could start thinking about, or that maybe we already have some products that are underway.
Again, I'm looking at David or Alan. Anybody else? Michelle?
Yes, but we'll have to talk about that in detail later, I think, right?
Yeah, we have a few meetings coming up, and so Michelle mentioned that as well. If you go to the delmarvalandandlitter.net website, the partner meetings and events are listed, and I can drop that link in the chat. If people want to know more about those, and those are some of the places where we'll be talking about those types of products and next steps.
Sure. I can send, what I can do that we didn't have listed on these slides was all of the data sets that we evaluated to identify the streams in Pennsylvania. Might give you some ideas about, it was really diverse, lots of different types of data sets that might be helpful.
Yeah, I think that would be great, because I feel like sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And so if we see something, a list like that, could really help jog our brains of, oh yeah, we don't have that, and that would be really useful. So that would be wonderful.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Michelle, I'll just say that I think calling out and celebrating along the way is a huge part of why this can be successful. A shout out to my team member Megan, who nominated one of these catchments for an award at the local county planning commission for their leadership award. And so the award went to 4 different partner organizations that did all the technical assistance, the outreach, the farmer relationship building. It is based in this strategy, but that kind of award, that kind of focus on the people and the process to get there is really, I'm just so glad that she did that it was recognized for the great success that it is. But I will also call out that that is a public event. There were pictures, there were social media posts, and the award went to the partner organizations. But it's the landowners that made the decisions. It's the landowners that made the changes and the commitment to conservation. So we're going to host a separate breakfast for them outside of the public sphere, because most of them, if not all, are members of the Plain community, and they wouldn't have chosen to be there. So we want to acknowledge and celebrate them in the right cultural way as well.
I'm really glad you said that. I think that's so important to also word of mouth, making people feel appreciated. They're definitely going to talk about it. They're definitely going to be excited about it. So that's a really, really, really good point. And I like the separate celebration too. We've talked about that internally at my organization, just with making sure that you're thinking about what works well for the people you're working with, not just, what works well for you. And so I think having that separate celebration just even highlights that even more. That's great. All right. Carly, Allison, this was amazing. Thank you so, so much. I know I learned a lot, and I think everybody got a lot out of this. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to continuing our conversation. I think you both are going to be really helpful to us as we move forward. So thank you again. Just a reminder to everybody, we did record this, so we will get it sent out if you want to watch it again, or if you want to share it with folks who wanted to be here but weren't able. Paula will work on getting that out to everybody. It'll be on the website. She just posted that link. And I think that about wraps it up. Thank you again, Carly and Allison, and thank you, Paula and Michelle, for helping to organize this. And thank you all for attending today. I hope everyone has a great Friday and a good weekend.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.